You are mid-sentence. You know exactly where you're going. The thought is right there, fully formed, already moving toward your mouth. And then it's gone. Not paused, not delayed. Gone. You blink. You try to backtrack. You say while your brain makes a sound like a hard drive spinning with nothing to show for it. That's a brain fart. And the harder you try to grab it, the further it retreats. Here's what almost nobody tells you. The smarter you are, the more often this happens. Not occasionally. Structurally. Systematically. The very cognitive machinery that makes someone fast, creative, and capable of holding complex ideas is the same machinery that makes brain farts more frequent, more sudden, and more total. The blank isn't a sign of a weak mind. It's a side effect of a very busy one. And the science behind why is stranger than you'd expect. To understand what a brain fart actually is, you have to understand what your brain is doing at any given moment, which is far more than you think. Right now, as you process this, your brain is maintaining your current goal, tracking the context you're in, holding several threads of recent information, monitoring your environment for anything that might need attention, suppressing irrelevant thoughts that keep trying to push through, and updating its predictions about what's coming next. All of this runs in parallel. All of it competes for the same underlying resource. Cognitive scientists call this resource working memory, and it is extraordinarily limited. Alan Baddeley, a British psychologist who spent decades building what became the most widely accepted model of working memory, described it as a system with a central executive, a kind of mental control tower, managing a small number of temporary storage slots. The capacity of those slots is small. Estimates have varied across decades of research, but the working consensus has long hovered around 4 to 7 discrete chunks of information at any given moment. Not 4 to 7 thoughts, 4 to 7 chunks. When you're in the middle of a complex sentence, tracking its grammar, its intent, the social context of who you're speaking to, and the next two things you want to say after this one, you're already pushing toward the edge. Add one distraction, one competing thought, one piece of new information arriving from the environment, and something drops. That's the first mechanism behind a brain fart. Working memory overload. The system hit its limit, a lower priority item got pushed out, and what got pushed out happened to be the thread you were in the middle of following. Not a malfunction, an overflow. But there's a second mechanism, and this one is where the intelligence connection becomes precise. It's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, and it was first studied systematically by Roger Brown and David McNeil at Harvard in 1966. Brown and McNeil gave participants definitions of obscure words and asked them to retrieve the word itself. Sometimes participants knew immediately. Sometimes they drew a blank. But a third, fascinating category emerged. Participants who knew the word was there, could feel its weight, could sometimes even report its first letter, the number of syllables, words it rhymed with, but could not retrieve the actual word. They were stuck at the edge of knowing, tantalizingly close, completely blocked. Brown and McNeil called this the tip of the tongue state. What it revealed is something important about how memory retrieval actually works. It isn't a single step. You don't just reach into storage and pull something out whole. Retrieval is a multi-stage process. First, you access the meaning of what you're looking for. Then, separately, you access the phonological form, the actual sounds and word. These two steps are handled by different systems, and they can fail independently, which means you can know exactly what you want to say, feel completely certain you have it, and still be unable to retrieve the form the moment you need it. Here's where the intelligence piece comes in. Psychologist Donna Dahlgren proposed something that initially sounds counterintuitive. The more you know, the more tip-of-the-tongue states you experience. Not because your retrieval gets worse, but because the more information you have stored in long-term memory, the more competing pathways activate when you try to retrieve anything. The target word sits in a network of related words, similar sounds, associated concepts, overlapping meanings. When you reach for it, all of those neighbors activate too. And sometimes the neighbors, the words that sound similar or share meaning with the target, are loud enough to create interference that briefly blocks the one you actually want. A person with a richer vocabulary, a wider knowledge base, a denser web of associations is running a more complex retrieval network. More nodes, more competition, more chances for the signal to get crowded out at exactly the wrong moment. It's not that the thought is gone, it's that the path to it is temporarily jammed by everything else you know. There's a third mechanism that researchers have identified, and this one connects to attention in a way that should feel almost viscerally familiar. It's called the attentional blink. In 1992, Jane Raymond and her colleagues at Cambridge demonstrated something remarkable. When the brain successfully processes one target item, there is a window of roughly 200 to 500 milliseconds immediately afterward, during which it is dramatically less able to register a second target. The brain, having committed resources to processing the first thing, creates a brief but real gap in conscious attention. The second item arrives during that gap and simply doesn't get through. The attentional blink isn't a quirk or an edge case. It appears to reflect a fundamental constraint on how conscious processing works. You can only fully process one thing at a time. There's a queue, and the queue has a bottleneck. If two things arrive too close together, one of them doesn't make it into awareness. Think about what that means across your whole day. You're not just experiencing one conversation or one task at a time. You're experiencing a continuous stream of inputs, words, sounds, faces, notifications, half-formed intentions, physical sensations, all arriving in rapid sequence, all competing to be processed. Your brain is making thousands of decisions per second about what gets through and what waits. Most of these decisions happen entirely below the level of your awareness. The attentional blink is just the moment when one of those decisions briefly becomes visible to you. Now, think about what happens in a complex conversation. Ideas are arriving quickly. You are generating new ones just as fast. Someone says something that partially matches something you were about to say. A noise interrupts briefly. A word you just used activates a chain of associations you didn't ask for. All of this is happening in rapid sequence, and any of it can land in the window right after something else your brain was processing. The thread you were holding gets submitted to the queue. The queue is busy. The thread doesn't make it through. The brain fart is the moment you notice the gap. And the people who think fastest, who are generating the most ideas per second, who are making connections between things most people wouldn't even notice are related, are the ones creating the most congestion in that queue. The speed is an advantage almost everywhere. At the bottleneck, it's a liability. This also explains something you've probably noticed about brain farts. They tend to happen more when you're excited, stressed, or trying to perform. A calm, low-stakes conversation with someone you trust rarely produces them. A job interview, a first date, a presentation, a moment when you are acutely aware that what you say next matters. Those are the moments the blank arrives. Anxiety doesn't just make you feel worse. It occupies working memory directly. A 2011 study by psychologist Cian Baylock at the University of Chicago found that in high-pressure situations, intrusive, self-monitoring thoughts consume the same cognitive resources you're trying to use for the task. The system runs hotter, the limit comes sooner. What gets dropped is exactly what you most needed to hold. So the brain fart isn't random. It tends to happen to smart people under pressure, in the middle of complex tasks, when the cognitive load is highest, which is to say, precisely in the moments that matter most. The very conditions that make you want to perform at your best are the conditions most likely to trigger the failure you're most afraid of, which is an uncomfortable irony. But it stops being as uncomfortable when you understand what it actually means. The baseline for a brain fart isn't stupidity. The baseline is a system running near capacity. A system with nothing loaded doesn't crash. A system doing nothing doesn't freeze. The blank you experience is evidence of a brain that was doing a great deal and hit a very human limit that every brain shares. Baddeley's working memory model also showed something that often gets overlooked. The system is not fixed. Its effective capacity changes with practice, with sleep, with stress levels, with emotional state. People who are well rested, emotionally regulated, and practiced in the domain they're working in show fewer retrieval failures, not because their limit is higher, but because they've organized the information more efficiently, requiring fewer resources to access it. Chunking, the brain's ability to group related pieces of information into single units, is one of the primary ways experts navigate complex tasks without hitting the wall. A chess grandmaster doesn't see 32 individual pieces. They see patterns, configurations, moves, each one a single chunk. The same content, radically fewer slots required. A musician who has played a piece 1,000 times doesn't think about individual notes. The whole phrase is a single unit. A surgeon who has performed the same procedure hundreds of times doesn't consciously track every step. The sequence has been compressed into a reliable, retrievable whole. In each case, expertise isn't just knowing more, it's knowing more efficiently, in a form that makes fewer demands on the limited space working memory has to offer. Which is also why novices in any domain are more prone to brain farts about that domain than experts are. The novice is holding every piece separately, filling up working memory slot by slot. The expert has bundled them. Same knowledge, far lighter load. What that means practically is that the brain fart problem isn't really a memory problem, it's a load management problem. And load can be managed. Not by trying harder, which adds more load, but by slowing down slightly, by giving the retrieval queue time to clear, by trusting that the thought you dropped hasn't been deleted. It's just sitting one step below the surface, waiting for the interference to settle. Which is also why the thought often comes back the moment you stop trying to find it. You let go, you do something else, the queue empties, and there it is, right where you left it. You are mid-sentence. You know exactly where you're going. The thought is right there. And if it disappears for a second, it's not because your mind is weak. It's because your mind has so much in it that even the path to what you know can briefly get too crowded to walk. That's not a brain fart. That's a full brain, briefly at capacity. There's a difference. And knowing the difference changes how you talk to yourself the next time the blank arrives.